Welcome to an SRBT webinar on recent updates and recommendations regarding SART's advertising guidelines. This webinar was developed by the Society of Reproductive Biologists, Technologists, as an educational resource and service to its members and other reproductive professionals. While this webinar reflects the views of the panelists, it is not intended to be the only approved standard of practice or to dictate an exclusive course of treatment. Members should always use their best judgment in determining a course of action and be guided by the needs of the individual patient, available resources, and institutional or clinical practice limitations. All attendees will be muted except the presenter. Time at the end of the presentation will be reserved for questions. Please type a question in the question chat window at any time. The moderators will read as many selected questions as possible to the presenter during the allotted question and answer time. Also note that this is an interactive session, and if you would like to ask Dr. Reshef follow-up questions, you may request that your mic be unmuted. A recording of this webinar will be archived on the ASRM website in the coming weeks, so please watch your email for notification. I will now turn the presentation over to Brad.
Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Brad Millett. I'm the current president of SRBT, and today we have a wonderful talk from Dr. Eli Reshef, who is the chairperson of the SART Advertising Committee and member of their executive SART board. Today we also have joining us our David Russell, who is SRBT's SART representative, as well as Liesl Nell Timat, who is our current president-elect. Dr. Reshef will be speaking about the SART advertising guidelines and give a little background into their process. We hope to have a fairly open discussion following the presentation, so please, like Sarah mentioned earlier, submit your questions in the chat. You know we are already ready to learn from Dr. Reshef today, so with that, I'll turn it over to David, who will introduce Dr. Reshef. David?
Thank you very much, Brad. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone today. And I know some of you who are on the meeting, so it's great to see everyone who's joined us. I'd just like to give a little background on Dr. Reshef. Dr. Reshef is a board certified REI and an infertility specialist in clinical practice for over 33 years. He's been involved with SART leadership for 13 years as a board member, past chairperson of the SART Quality Assurance Committee, and the current chairperson of the Advertising Committee. Dr. Reshef has received the ASRM Distinguished Service Award and the Resolve Hope Award for Advocacy, and is actively involved in medical advocacy in Oklahoma and nationwide. Apart from his busy clinical REI practice, he sits on several nonprofit boards, mental health assistance to first responders, providing access to recreation areas to people with disabilities among them. And he takes full advantage of Oklahoma City's rowing, swimming, and running opportunities. Thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Reshef, and we're really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm honored, really. I'll start my talk by exposing my flank first. So here it goes. Here's my flank. Here's my cell number. And anybody that wishes to call me if they have follow-up questions or otherwise, or anything that has to do with SART advertising, call me on my cell anytime, 405-204-7249. That's my flank. So, and again, this is not just an exercise. Please call me if you have any issues regarding advertising or anything that within my particular area of expertise. So today I'd like to do something a bit unusual, because if you look at SART as a passenger ship, the name is Destination Live Birth. And really take the name seriously. And if you look at SART as a skipper of that ship, the crew, of course, are the SART programs. We have an above deck and below deck. So the below deck are the engine room engineers and otherwise, and that's you guys who are listening, most of you that are listening, if you are members of SRBT. It's the HCLDs and the ELDs and the embryologists or otherwise that really run the show. And I never forget to thank the people in the lab that sit in the darkness, you know, kind of sort of an engine room and really motor the entire ship. But let's not forget that the ship is named Destination Live Birth, and that's really our goal. I know that when we sent the communication through the portal to everybody about the new guidelines, all of a sudden what happened was that people that never really heard from SART, since they log on to the portal, whether they enter data or otherwise, learned that we have advertising guidelines. And of course, there was some response, feedback, or otherwise, some of it a little bit racy or otherwise, you know, it's a free society, and I really appreciate that as much as you do. If you look at the advertising committee as the HR of the passenger ship, and I despise HR, believe me, but unfortunately, the advertising committee basically is the HR of the passenger ship. Basically, we dictate the code of conduct, so to speak. And why should we have code of conduct? Because we want to make sure that our passengers, our patients, are served correctly. So that's why SART has instituted since 1999 advertising guidelines. We revise them every once in a while. And once again, and I'll repeat it at the very end, we are the only medical organization that has advertising oversight, believe it or not. It's not the AMA, it's not ASRM, it's not any of the medical societies that, or SRBT for that matter, it's SART that has advertising oversight. We have policy, we have guidelines, and we expect the members to comply. In a second, I'll talk about the approach and otherwise, and let's move to the next slide. So who do I interact with primarily through the advertising committee? I'm the chairperson. I've been doing it now for 3 years, and I have 2 more years remaining to a total of 6. Prior to that, as David said, I served as the chair of the QA committee. And if you chair a committee for SART, you also are part of the board. We have 11 members, they are, including myself. Actually, I think it's 12 now because we added somebody recently. They're from all over the country. We have East, West, and Center. We have males, females, academia individuals. We have HCLDs, nurses. We are now thinking about inviting a layperson to at least monitor our committee through Resolve, so that we can have all the input from every aspect of the reproductive spectrum, including patients. Basically, I assign programs, clinics, website to review. So each member of our committee, and we have several of them on board here on this webinar, will review anywhere from 10 to 12 programs a year, which encompasses about 1/3 of all SART programs. So basically, a program is reviewed every 3 years, unless there are any unusual circumstances, there are complaints against the program, or the program complaints against some other program, then we do an earlier review of both the complainant and the complainee. There are certain guidelines that we follow on the reviewing website, and use the guidelines. You can get to the guidelines through the SART website. They're there for anybody that logs on as a SART member and even non-SART member. And if you ever need a copy, I'll send you one. So as I mentioned, we also investigate complaints of a clinic against another clinic. If your clinic has seen a brochure that the competing clinic uses to dispense among OBGYNs or other physicians, giving false information about their program, their results, or otherwise, we address that as well, but we also ask to have concrete copy of that brochure or billboard or otherwise, so we can address that with the quote-unquote offending program. Next slide. If there are no violations, we either notify the clinic through a letter, through the portal, and I'll talk about the portal here in a second, If violations exist, the medical director typically is contacted by a member of our advertising committee, either through the portal, talk about the portal in a minute, by phone, or through the SART mobile app, or by other means. We try to stay away. We used to, up until recently, call. But you know, when we call a program, and we talk to the secretary or the receptionist, and we tell them we were from SART Advertising Committee, immediately it sounds like a solicitation call. So it kind of slows down the process of getting directly to the program or the medical director. When we contact a program, we give them 2 weeks to fix the violations on their website. And you know, in this day and age, it takes minutes to fix the website. I know that sometimes if you are part of a university program, you're part of a larger system that's a little bit more cumbersome, but clearly 2 weeks we feel is a fair enough warning for the program. And the majority of them will respond within 2 weeks. And then I send them an acknowledgement that the guidelines have been followed, they're in compliance, and that's it. If we don't hear, if we do the 2 weeks and we tell them violations and we don't hear from them, they have not fixed it in 30 days, then we have several steps that we follow. We put a red flag on their SART CSR. You know, if you go on the website of SART, you see their clinical success rate, and we will put a red flag. And the red flag basically says this program is in violation of SART advertising guidelines. Please view their statistics with caution. As you can imagine, if you get a red flag, now it's beginning to hurt your pocketbook, because even if your patients read it, you know, that's a red flag. So a lot of programs, if they get, and there aren't a lot of programs that get a red flag because the majority will comply within 2 weeks, they respond fairly quickly. If we do not hear from them after 90 days, SART will remove their data altogether from the SART website. Now, they can still have their data on the CDC, but if you are a patient, you look at SART, you log on, you're not going to have that clinic's data anymore. There'll be a flag that will say, because of non-compliance, the data has been removed. If we hear no response, there are no corrections or violations within 6 months, then the clinic may be up for loss of membership. Next slide. It sounds pretty draconian, but hear ye, hear ye. Currently, and I'm going to go over that again, remind you, there are no, first of all, in our history, no program, my history, no program was expelled from SART for advertising violations alone. So even though we do have the mechanism to kick a program out of SART for non-compliance, we never had to do it under my shift. That's number one. Number two, we don't currently have any programs that had their data removed from the SART CSR, SART website. Number three, we don't have any programs currently that have a red flag over their CSR data. Ergo, from 2020, all programs now are in full compliance. And we do it with kindness, not with any draconian type of behavior, because we know fully well that we're dealing with colleagues. So what's the advertising guidelines? We don't want to represent our data. If you were familiar with what happened 10 years ago or beyond, or even 5 years ago, you'll see there was a free-for-all in terms of advertising. We're the best program in the nation. We're the best program in the Denver area. We have the best equipment in the entire Midwest. All those statements could not be substantiated, and oftentimes were not true. Remember that we are here at the service of our passengers, our patients, and therefore we have, in a way, a code of conduct. We don't always like it, but nevertheless, we all comply or try to comply with it, because otherwise we're going to start hurting each other, competing programs or especially our patients. So we don't want to misrepresent our success data, and in a second I'll show you some examples of misrepresentation. We don't want to badmouth other programs either, because it's going to be a boomerang, and use unsupported statement. We're the best. We're the sharpest. We don't want to use those statements because oftentimes they cannot be substantiated. You also do not or cannot compare your program stats to other programs in your area, because every program has their own patient population, operates under different premises and otherwise. You can compare your data to the national average, but not to programs in your area. Next slide, please. So this is a summary of the guidelines. We're not going to belabor it. You can find it on the SART website, but I would say that the following: adherence to SART advertising policy is a requirement for membership in SART. Remember that the programs must comply with the guidelines of the Federal Trade Commission, which means the no false advertising. It must not lead the patients or the public to believe that the chances of success are greater than they really are. Remember, we're destination live birth here. We're not destination implantation rate. We're not destination clinical pregnancy rate or biochemical pregnancy. We're destination live birth. If a clinic chooses to display success rates, it has obviously permission to do that, but they must comply with SART format. And SART format primarily includes cycle starts or intended retrievals and live birth per cycle starts or per intended retrievals. Okay, now we don't compel SART programs to advertise their success rate. You are not compelled to do so. If you do, however, you can do it in various ways. You can simply, as I do with my program, put a link to the SART CSR, and the patient will click it, and then they'll see the entire presentation from SART CSR. I know it's confusing. I don't like it either. We created a snapshot, if any of you are familiar with that, which on the upper right-hand corner of your clinic's report, there is a snapshot that has only 4 categories, and we have a hover text, and a patient, a clinician, or otherwise can interpret the information a little bit more easily, as opposed to looking at the entire data set. Remember that we as clinicians and scientists and otherwise feel compelled to report all the data, but that is extremely confusing to patients and other lay people. So you're not obligated to report your success rates. If you do, you can do it as a single link and no elaboration. If you choose to elaborate, in other words, if you want to do graphs, if you don't want to do other, you must have a direct link to the SART CSR. And the new guidelines also say, please copy and paste the snapshot so that the public will see your clinic's results in just a 1-page summary. And then if you want to elaborate with bar graphs and otherwise, please do so, but remain in a SART language format. You must have supported and verifiable claims. If you want to use plasma-rich, protein-rich plasma in your patients, and you say, we're up to date, this is the most modern treatment to thicken the endometrium, please put a reference, because there are very few of those that really are reliable. Ranking programs is prohibited. You're not the #1 program in the country, because the only people that rank programs are, it's not SART, it's not the CDC, it's some of the other websites that get paid by you to rank them. And we prohibit that. And so let's move to the next slide. And let me give you some example. And this is by Overlake Reproductive Health. This is all data that's up, that's obviously open to the public. And the reason I took Overlake is because they decided to leave SART recently because they said, we cannot handle your advertising guidelines. They're too oppressive. And we had a long conversation, many a conversation over many a year with Overlake, and said, you need to comply. I spent many a time on the phone with their medical director and otherwise, and they chose to leave SART. And I think that's obviously their prerogative. But let me show you a few examples of their website as of day before yesterday. First, you cannot compare your results to other regional clinics. And some of you guys on the call, especially in the middle of the country, know fully well that some of your competing programs that either used to be in SART and choose to leave or otherwise advertise in such a way that they compare programs in their area. We say this is a big no-no because every program has its own patient population. So Here are some success rates, and we'll go over the success rates here and how you depict them in the next slide, please. Okay. Here's what your patient sees on the website. What's yellow captures your attention, right? Right. Now, I am a patient who just logged on to Overlake, and here is the success depiction. 72.7 live birth per transfer, which is phenomenal. But wait. So I don't look at the other numbers because I'm a layperson. I don't know statistics or otherwise. And so I look at the yellow and I said, whoa. But you and I look at the statistics a little closer. If you look further down, number of intended retrievals, it's 67, right? How many transfers were made? 44. That basically is 35% no transfer, guys. So I, the patient who paid $25,000 to do PGT on all, to freeze all my embryos and do a single embryo transfer after the PGT, 35% of patients who paid that big bucks will not have a transfer, okay? So you immediately see that the 44 patients that were basically the denominator, 32 got pregnant and had live birth all right, but if you take 32 divide by 67, you are now looking at the live birth rate per intended retrieval that's very much in par with the SART average success rate. Patient cannot do that, cannot make that analogy. And the bottom line is that the patient is misled, okay? So the 2018 national average for frozen embryo transfer for SART is 47%. Guess what? Overlake and SART are essentially identical, but the patient will only see the 72.7%. Next slide. And that's from the same program. And of course, you look at the blues, and the blues are Overlake Reproductive Center. And of course, all the blues are bigger than the national average. There's nothing wrong with comparing yourself to the national average. But if you compare your transfers with the national average, which is per intended retrieval, you're comparing apples to oranges and mislead your patients. So again, we're the HR. We're the people who would like to make sure that we all speak the same language to our passengers, to our patients. We want to speak, we want to prevent, we want to make sure that there is truth in advertising. Next slide. Next, thank you. All right, this is the portal, and some of you may be familiar with that because you might enter data for SART from your program, or maybe you're part of the SART board and you can see at the bottom, there's an advertising portal, and this is now our preferred means of communication with SART programs. It's for some of us, from some of you, it may be daunting, but actually it's a pretty handy way. The problem is you need to check the website. You need to check the portal if you're a SART clinic so that you'll know if we, the advertising committee, membership committee, QA, or validation have communicated with you. All right, next. And by the way, we sent our communication to all programs through the portal. So obviously many of you have received the communication, and all of a sudden the people that are manning the engine room realize that there is an HR with some guidelines. And some of you had some pretty interesting reaction to the oversight, and I appreciate that very much. This is what we do. I know I'm not going to get into the details, but I assign clinics for my committee members. When we close a case, when the case is closed, when there's full compliance, you can see the orange closed. The clinic will get a message, and we'll move on to review other programs. If you look at the middle and you see complaints in the very middle, just above the blue tab that says add new complaint, this is how we communicate the complaints to our clinics. If you look at the next tab, which say communication, this is how we communicate our grievance or suggestions to our members. Next slide. So you can see more or less what I see now, the programs that we, how many times we reviewed them, and when was the latest review, and the SART number and all that. I don't want to bore you with the details. Next slide. All right. Look at the box there, and these are the categories of violations: claims of superiority, unsubstantiated claims, supplemental data not compliant, etc. You can read just as well as I do. And I touched on it before, and it makes it easier for those of us that review programs' websites to classify the complaints, and then we can elaborate. Okay, and then we send it to the program and expect a response. Next slide. So how effective are we? Once again, I said we review 1/3 of all SART clinics per year. I'm very heartened by the fact that despite what appears to be heavy-handed response, and we are a voluntary organization, SART is, and nevertheless, we have an incredible amount of compliance. First, in the first 2 weeks of pointing out, well, to begin with, about 50% of programs are fully compliant when we review them. The remainder, and there are many violations, by the way, and most of those are very innocent violations, not out of malice or otherwise, because people are not familiar with the advertising guidelines, or people have a third party that manages their website. And third party, of course, their interest is to promote you, to make you look good, and oftentimes they're not familiar with the advertising guidelines. So, but the majority of programs will respond very promptly within 2 weeks, and they fix it. Last year, in 2020, we had 5 red flags, meaning people that did not comply within 30 days. So we put a red flag on their advertising, on their success rate on the SART website. And as of now, they're all compliant, because I took the time as the chair to call each one of their medical directors and say, hey guys, we don't want to be heavy-handed, but you're in violation. Many of them said, but we didn't know that, because sometimes there is a disconnect between the medical program director and who runs their website. And so we don't have any clinics that have their data removed, and rarely, if ever, as I mentioned before, a program loses membership over advertising violations. Once again, and this I believe is the last slide, SART is the only medical society in the United States and probably in the world with advertising oversight. Because remember, our passengers are our patients, and they are vulnerable to anything that we do or say. And I know many of you had significant negative feedback about the fact that we're not using implantation rates as a parameter. And remember, our patients are not interested in implantation rates. You, as the hard workers in the lab, might be, and some of you may be rewarded, even financially, for your implantation rates. Patients want a live baby in their arms, not clinical pregnancy rates or positive HCG or implantation rates, but a baby in their arm. I appreciate your attention. I'll answer any question you have.
Great, thank you, Dr. Reshef. We'll start off with some questions. We got a bunch in, so we are ready to go. So the first one we have here, so it reads, the new guidelines seem specifically designed to compare clinics, yet SART has stated that they do not want these stats to be used for that purpose. What efforts are being made to prevent these guidelines from facilitating superficial comparison of clinics?
The whole thrust of the guidelines is not to compare success rates. And I know that it's almost anti-American not to have success rates compared. But remember this, guys, this is not industry where the parameters are similar, or where a beauty product program can say, or industry says our results are better, and they don't have to substantiate that. We're dealing with live patients. We're dealing with different parameters. Some programs, especially university-based, but not all, take hard patients, poor prognosis patients. And I'm reminded about 25 years ago when I saw the stats on cardiovascular surgery outcome by various institutions in various parts of the country. And it was interesting that the university-based programs had poor results. Why? Because they are the recipient of many of the toughest cases. All of us know that sometimes we get patients that came from other programs, older patients, low AMH patients, poor ovarian reserve patients, and unless they are such poor prognosis that our conscience does not permit us to allow them to do IVF, after the appropriate counseling, many of us will do those tough cases. Some of us will not. And this is, everybody has the prerogative of taking patients or not. If you want to exclude patients over 40 BMI from your program, that's your prerogative. However, if you look at data, and the data does not directly point to the fact that if you have high BMI, you're going to have poor IVF results. And even if you do, somebody needs to service those patients. And so all of a sudden, those comparisons, and I know it's a long answer to a short question, some of those comparisons are not valid. And let's be fair to our programs that work very hard. Let's be fair to our patients and compare our results to the national success rates, as long as we use the same parameters. Live birth per intended retrieval. You can put on your supplemental data live birth per transfer, but make sure that you compare it to the national live birth per transfer and make sure that the patient know the distinction. Next question, please.
Okay, Dr. Reshef, I have a question from Dr. Jindal here. Sangeeta, you may know her. She says, how do we combat non-SART clinic advertising in our area, which is totally misleading to patients?
Well, some of us who may have a smile on their face know what she's talking about. It's a problem. Because if Overlake in Seattle advertises incredible statistics, and our good friend Paul Lynn can only hunker down, have his blood pressure go up, and there's nothing he can do. We cannot sue them, or otherwise they're not members of SART. We don't have any oversight of their program. Now, this is a problem. This is a problem. But you know what? And I know this sounds a little moralistic, a little maybe not scientific. Let's do the right thing. 85% of all IVF programs in the country are part of SART. They choose to do the right thing and comply with various guidelines, okay? If you're part of the 15% that choose not to be, and you use it as an excuse to advertise flagrantly, either the wrong data, incorrect data, or comparison data, you know what? That's your prerogative. But for those 85% of programs of SART that do it voluntarily and pay big money to be part of SART, yet choose to be compliant, and that's the beauty of SART. You can leave SART anytime. But you're not going to be part of an exclusive club that takes pride in its oversight, not only of advertising, but of other things like QA, membership, things like that. If you don't want to be part of it, that's your prerogative. If you want to be part of it, and most people choose to be, then be compliant. And yes, I realize that programs in your area who are not part of SART will not be compliant and have outrageous claims. Nothing you can do about it. Sorry. Other questions?
All right, we have another question here from Christian Ivani. So who polices the violations that some clinics are reported above? Is it an individual's program's job to report these violations?
No. First of all, I admit I'm the police. I'm HR. And by the way, I detest HR. Many of you do too. So when I put myself in the same category, I'm sorry, I'm kind of exposing my other flank to you, but somebody has to take care of that. So that's that the police basically, and I hate to use that term because we're the kind and gentle police, and some of you that have interacted with us know what I mean, that we don't yell and scream and threaten, and otherwise we point out violations and we try to explain why. And the bottom line is, even if you don't agree, please comply, because it's going to boomerang back to you when somebody else violates. So we are the police, yes, but we do it in a kind and gentle way. We don't have guns, we have batons that we hardly ever use, okay? We deal with colleagues, and the colleagues are not only the medical director and the program directors, the colleagues are also you guys in the engine room. I know it sounds a little preachy, but I gave my phone number so people can call me and either complain or ask for clarification and otherwise. We are the police, and we're unique in the sense that we are part of an organization that has advertising oversight for the sake of our patients first and foremost.
It looks like Sangeeta has a follow-up question. Sangeeta, would you like to ask this question yourself? I'm not sure if she is still with us here. So her question says, does Eli recommend linking the snapshot report to clinic websites? There's Sangeeta.
Hi, sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. I think Ellie, hi Ellie, nice to see you. I think you answered the question earlier on, so my question's a little bit out of date, but I feel like the snapshot report is fantastic, and that's really going to be helpful. Do you recommend actually cutting and pasting it or putting a link to it for our websites?
I recommend both actually, but it's easy to cut and paste. You can also put a link, whichever is the easiest, because your patients don't always know about the snapshot. And just for the sake of everybody listening, the snapshot was created after people on the SART board realized, after many a complaint and otherwise, that the data we present is so daunting. And you need a PhD, ACLD, and everything else after your name to start interpreting the data. And so we created an abbreviated form that has a hover text that uses layman's term as to what we mean by category 1, category 2, category 3, and category 4. Hopefully more people will understand and create much less of a messy situation. We realize it's not ideal. Data to begin with is complex, and not everybody is savvy about that. And by the way, let me remind everybody, in 1992, Ron Wyden, who's still in Congress, has created the reporting law. And by law, every program that does IVF, SART program or not, has to report its success rate to a national repository. SART is one, and NAS is the other one, CDC. And you cannot run an IVF program and not report your success rate for everyone to see. And I think that's an incredible asset, because how many of you are aware of any other medical specialties that report outcomes? I'll mention one, and it's for the transplantation service, UNOS, UNOS. So if you want to know each transplantation program, what success, morbidity, mortality, success rate, rejection, whatever, you can do the same thing. You can go on UNOS, UNOS, and get very much like you get from SART or CDC, national success rates. But God forbid, should you need a cardiovascular or coronary artery bypass, do you know the success rate, morbidity, and mortality of your surgeon? No, and you won't, because they don't have those statistics posted for everyone to see. So the 1992 progressive, onerous, yes, but progressive act by Congress, and yes, it government oversight, and you can complain about it and all that. I do too sometimes, but it's for the service of patients. So they're not everybody, it's not the Wild West here where everybody advertises some incredible results. And by the way, don't do that exercise. I do it frequently. I review a lot of websites. And if you ever listen to Garrison Keillor on Lake Wobegon, where he says Lake Wobegon, where everybody is, handsome and everybody's above average. Well, if you look at the websites, every program is the best in the country and the leading program and otherwise. Well, we all know that the law of averages does not support that. And that's why we have advertising oversight. Next, Brad.
All right. So I guess we could open it up to the floor to general discussion. So if folks want to unmute and turn on their video, they can go ahead and ask a question to Dr. Reshef, if that's okay with you.
I have a question. Dr. Reshef, thank you so much for joining us and giving this great presentation. I feel like you and I are like family because we've spoken on the phone so many times. It's great to see you in person, or at least have your face in front of me. My question is why, and you will know exactly where this comes from, but why does SART allow non-SART clinics to report good old faithful SART clinics? And then no matter what the non-SART clinics do, they don't get in any trouble because they're not SART reporting. SART can do anything to them, but they get to report under the SART clinics. It seems very unfair.
Yeah. And that is an incredibly important question. And this just exposes the unfairness of the process. Fortunately, there are very, very few isolated cases of a non-SART program reporting a SART program violating SART advertising guidelines. And thank goodness for that, because, there's no recourse. Basically, I'll give you an example. Names will not be named, but here's in a city, large city in the United States, there was a program that is not a SART program. They chose to leave SART, but then they sent me a long letter complaining about a SART program's advertising practices. And I said, that's not fair. But on the other hand, it kind of perks your interest, because then I reviewed the program that was reported, and there were some violations, and I contacted the program and I asked them to correct it, and they very faithfully did so. But of course, the revulsion that we all feel about not being able to reciprocate, because what I normally do when a SART program complains about another SART program is I review the program that was complained about and the complainer, just to make sure that the cattle in the pot, the story. Well, I happened to review the complaining program's website, and remember, they're no longer SART members, and they had multiple violations. And I wrote a long letter back and I said, guys, you are yourselves in significant violation of SART guidelines. What gives you the privilege of complaining about a SART program? And I never heard back from them. So that's the privilege of not being a SART program. You don't have to comply, and you don't have to answer back. No recourse there.
So what would you recommend? You just ignore it? As if that happens to you?
I did not ignore it. I myself, as advertising committee, did not ignore it. So I responded to the program and I said, hey guys, I know you're no longer a SART program, but would you have the honesty, the fairness to be compliant also, even though you're not members of SART, for the sake of your patients, rather than, it's like a bumper sticker, you have a bumper sticker statement and then the car zips by and you're no longer accountable for what you say on the bumper sticker. You are accountable, but not as a member of SART. And I'm sorry, we don't have any oversight. We cannot report to the CDC because the CDC does not have advertising oversight. CDC is too busy and could care less.
Dr. Reshef, how many complaints do you get a year from other clinics? From outside even?
Not very many. I would say maybe 5 to 10 at the most. But here is the more heartwarming phenomenon that I see increasing. Programs call me before they change their advertising website or they have an advertising campaign, and they call me and say, will you please review our papers before we put it out to the public and spend a lot of money on? So that tells me that there is some credibility, and I try to do it kindly and gently, and of course not to tread on their rights to convey their practices, and otherwise just to make sure that if they're a SART program, they comply. I think it's very smart to say, okay, now we know that SART has new guidelines that were instituted in January of this year. we have some questions about it because we're just about to revise our website, and before we pay the eggheads a lot of money, can you please make sure that we are compliant? We wanted to put a copy of the snapshot. So I look, and obviously it's all confidential. And I say, well, maybe you should do things a little differently. Or no, you're right. You go for it. So not a lot of programs know yet to complain about other programs. And we hope that through the portal, people will do so. Or if any of you got my cell number, you can do it directly to me. Or you can go to SART, and Jacqueline Marshall at SART will refer to me very quickly.
So Dr. Reshef, I have a kind of a follow-up to David's there. So what are some like typical violations, whether they're minor or more egregious? And so, and in addition to that, kind of what goes into a review of a center? I know you said, I think you said that centers are reviewed every 3 years. So what can you typically see from a review?
I would say that unsubstantiated statements, supplemental data, success data that is not compliant with SART or incorrect or misleading, as you just saw, are probably the most common categories. I would say, though, the following, and that's the beauty of having a dialogue with your colleagues. Because sometimes when I review a program that has violations, they've been around for a long time. Their medical or program director is much older than I am, and I'm not young. They don't want to hear from me about their violations. Don't tell me what to do. So I had to navigate diplomatically and say kindly, please comply, and this is how you, and I sometimes even create their web context for them. Because they said, well, how do you think I should say that more correctly? And I basically, because I like to wordsmith, I tell them, you know what, consider saying that statement where you're the best in the area is to consider saying it slightly differently. Consider saying it, we have many years of experience. You can even say how many years of experience when you combine the experience of your crew in treating patients who are difficult, poor prognosis. We have experience, but don't compare yourself to other programs. And don't say statements which we see less often, but we see it. As opposed to other programs in our area that only take easy cases. Our program takes poor prognosis patients. We see it quite often. That's not fair. Because then you say we're doing stuff that other programs in our area don't do. We are the good guys, they are the bad guys. That's denigrating other programs, even though you don't mention the name. Because that makes the patient assume that you're the one doing the right thing and everybody else is skimming off the top, the low-hanging fruit, which is usually not correct. So tell the public what you do right. If you want to tell them that you take poor prognosis patients, if you tell them that we see cases that have not been successful in other programs, that's your prerogative. But don't compare yourself to other programs and don't denigrate other programs. So quickly about the review process. You look at the homepage, and oftentimes there are banners, there are statements and all that stand right up at you. That are completely incorrect. In a case of Overlake, for example, there was a banner that says our success rate is 72.7% for 2018 and did not elaborate. So basically saying, whoa, it's really good. And then you saw that I dissected it a little bit there, and that's misleading to patients. We're the best program in the city of Ames, Iowa. You can't say that. Even if your success rates for a specific year were better, you don't have the same patient population as your competing programs or program. So homepage. Then we look at About Us. Everybody has About Us. And that's where a lot of the statements, the aggrandizement statements come. Our medical director is the most experienced. REI in the city or in the state or in the country or whatever, et cetera, which oftentimes is incorrect or cannot be substantiated. Most importantly, you look at the success section. Some people will not have a success section, and that's their prerogative, but that's where most violations are. So either there is no direct link to SART, clinic-specific rate, there is no, supplemental data is non-compliant, or simply exaggerated or incorrect, as we saw in the presentation.
Dr. Reshef, another question from me. A lot of insurance companies now mandate SART membership to be labeled a Center of Excellence. So my question is, if a clinic joins SART so that they can get that label, and then they violate the advertising rules, will SART report them to the insurance companies?
Excellent question. Because today I sent a letter to the leadership of SART and say about a certain program of SART. On their website that I reviewed 2 days ago, there's still, we are a center of excellence by Aetna or by Progeny or by whoever. And SART makes the point to those insurance programs that, and SART doesn't dictate policy to insurance programs, but many times a stipulation, if you're a center of excellence, you must be a member of SART. So we try to point out to those insurance companies, and sometimes a longer process than we'd like, that the program is either no longer a member of SART or has never been a member of SART, and those claims are exaggerated, incorrect, or whatever. So it's TBD, but it's being addressed. I promise you that, Lisa.
Thank you. That's good to know.
Any other questions or discussion?
Dr. Reshef, I have a little bit more of a specific one. There does not appear to be efforts to discriminate between traditional cycles and low-cost options like natural cycle or mini-stim, which operate on a different, typically accurate approach. This is likely to affect the offerings of a clinic that focus on them. Is this a concern of SART?
It is, and we've discussed it for many years, and especially when I was the head of QA, I never felt good about calling programs that had success rate that was below the SART standard, and that's quality assurance, that's not advertising. So it's really more of a QA or registry rather than an advertising question, but that fairness for programs that choose to do minimal stimulation, for programs that do natural cycle, for programs in the past that used to transfer a single embryo before it became the standard of care, when they had success rate that was lower than not only the national average, but 2 standard deviations below, and we dinged them because that success rate, SART tried to consider that and create a category, and Sangeeta, you might be able to address that too, in which natural cycles are also counted rather than compared to stimulated cycles. This is not my area of expertise, but it is an area where I definitely see the unfairness. When people try to do good, when they try to make sure that their patients don't pay as much money and all that, for example, and it's not only that, but if people use the vaginal culture as opposed to the full lab, and results cannot always be compared there. I don't think there is a category for vaginal culture. So remember that SARTs try to catch up with technology. And better yet, the reporting of success rate tries to catch up with technology. And, we try to do right by being transparent, but being transparent as a scientist creates huge amount of categories, which are then daunting. And then they require us to do a snapshot. So you can see how we try to catch up, and clearly we don't always do the great job.
Let me comment. I think you enter whether a cycle is natural or vaginal culture, but I don't think it's reported in the clinic summary report separately. That's the issue. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions or discussion?
So I just have another comment. So if patients should not always believe the success rate because you cannot really compare it, you don't really truly have a baseline, why do we even report success rates at all? Because what are you comparing?
We're required by law to report success rates.
So you're basically there to make sure that, because we all have to make it fair, because we have to report to the CDC.
Yeah, there is no way, I mean, you're in violation of federal law if you don't report your success rates.
Yeah.
Now, as a segue to that, I would say the following. The 1992 Wyden Act required each IVF program to report success rates. It has then since morphed into a giant task for every program to enter fields and otherwise. And I will say the following without pointing fingers. I'm pointing fingers at the CDC. Sorry. The CDC then took the role of repository for the reports, obviously with the help of SART, and created more and more and more fields so we can create research. But that research is not part of the 1992 requirements. But SART, and I will point fingers at me, at the SART leadership and otherwise, does not have the muscle to fight the CDC. And I don't want to get into political arguments here, but remember, if we do not control the number of parameters that we report, then your poor data entry person, whether it's your nurse, your embryologist, your PhD, and otherwise, will have to click God knows how many patients on each patient when you enter data, some of which will be used for research, some of it will go into oblivion. And that's the onerous part of reporting success rates as the way it was morphed from 1992. So we've come a long way in being transparent on one hand, but being onerous not only to our patients the way we report it, but to ourselves by creating this very taxing system of reporting so that can maybe one day people can do some research and publish it in FNS or Human Reproduction.
Well, let me just ask you one last one. So you mentioned Ames, Iowa, and somebody said they're the best clinic. What if you're the only clinic in Ames, Iowa? Then are you able to to say you're the best clinic?
Well, if you want to say the best clinic, it's also false advertising because then the reader assumes that Ames, Iowa has more than one clinic. So likewise, that's a violation because that implies to the patient there, among the 15 clinics in Ames, Iowa, you're the best. That's false advertising. And we get on the case of people that do that.
Well, great. Thank you, Dr. Reshef, for giving our talk today. And thanks for everybody for attending and to our moderators. And I hope everybody got some good information out of it. So
thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Dr. Reshef.
Well, wrapping up the session real quick. Again, thank you, Dr. Reshef. Thank you to the moderators. This session was recorded and will be available on our website in the near future. I would say about 7 to 10 days, but please keep a watch on your email for notification about future webinars, a recording of this webinar, particularly from the series. And for any further questions or comments, please don't hesitate to contact us at webinars@asrm.org. This concludes the webinar.